Up a sermon series. We've been looking at relationships. If you've been here the last few weeks, we've talked about the value of authenticity and empathy and being steadfast. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about one more thing, which to me is maybe the hardest part of really building deep relationships. And it seems like it's one of the hardest things for most people to get over when they struggle with it. And I was trying to think how to get into that, and my mind went back to being a kid. I remember being a kid. I went to see my grandma it's not an exaggeration to say almost every day. It was a rare day when I didn't go to her house or see her. And we would go hang out, my brothers and I, and we would play in the barns, and we would run roughshod over her house. And why she put up with it, I can't even imagine. And then my Uncle Jim, who wasn't there by that point, he'd already went to school and was married, but he had left all his comic books there when he was a kid. And so there were all these late 60s, early 70s comic books, and I used to read through all those. And Superman was my favorite. I'm a big fan of Superman, and Superman could, faster than a speeding bullet and leap over tall buildings, and really strong and X-ray vision and all those things. But the word they used to describe Superman was a word that you don't really see anywhere else unless you're describing Superman, and it was that he was invulnerable. He was invulnerable. Nothing could get into him. He was strong enough that he could take it whatever. And I think it was partly why that resonated with me as a kid is that I felt very vulnerable. In school, you get credibility if you're a great athlete or if you're really pretty or if you're really rich, and I wasn't any of those things. And so going to school, you felt like you didn't have anything to offer. You might be ashamed of where you came from or ashamed of what you were about. And so because of that, you learned how to hide it, either behind humor or hide it behind being wild or hide it behind just being quiet and off in the distance where nobody could see you. You learned how to be invulnerable. And it was hard to get out of that habit when I was an adult, right? As an adult, sometimes I'd be in a circle of people, and again, I would just feel like I have nothing to offer here. I feel dumb. I don't know what they're talking about, or I feel out of place. I feel like I might be even being judged. And I used to think it'd be something I'd grow out of, but I don't think that it is. I think this loneliness and the struggle that comes with it is just part of life. It's just a wound for a lot of us that we try to keep hidden, but it's there. And so this week, what I wanted to talk about was being vulnerable, learning how to open up a little bit. And for me, that's a struggle. And it may not be for you, and that's awesome, but it is for me. And I got to believe it is for some people, too. And so I wanted to talk about that just a little bit. And so the first thing I did, after I'd read a little bit and I've been thinking about some things, I Googled up, vulnerability and just see. And one of the first things that popped up on the internet was this TED Talk by a sociologist named Brene Brown. And she's talking about the challenge that comes with vulnerability is that a lot of people never get there. And it's because in her research, she did like 10 years of research, shame. Her quote that she had that stuck with me, she said, "Shame is easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people knew it or saw it, that I wouldn't be worthy of that connection?" And she says this shame, this fear that you're unworthy somehow, we all have it. One thing she said that I thought was kind of funny, I wrote it down. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you want to talk about it, the more you have it, which I thought was interesting. There's this wound in all of us. And you can trace it biblically back to God saying about Adam that it's not good for man to be alone. We feel that. Now, I guess it should be mentioned, you certainly can be alone and not be lonely, but the opposite's true too. Sometimes you can be completely lonely in a crowd. Loneliness is something that can be depicted. She called it excruciating. We're underpinned by this excruciating vulnerability. So she does this research to try to figure out, well, if we all struggle with shame, what kinds of people learn to get past it and learn to connect deeply with others, and why do some not? And what she found was some people choose the path of courage. And to kind of distinguish that from bravery is a little bit, courage from the Latin cor, your heart. Cor means heart in Latin. And so that's where we get the word courage. And you have the courage to show your whole heart, the courage to be completely who you are and not worry what people are going to say, or do. It's the courage to say, I love you first. Right? It's the courage to take the first chance. It's the elementary school note again. Do you like me, yes or no, and passing that across the way and hoping that they'll say yes. It's the courage to take the chance to be known and to be loved. And again, according to her research, Brene Brown, a lot of us don't do it because of shame or guilt. So then I started thinking, with this shame and guilt thing, I wanted to kind of research that. Well, what do those terms mean, guilt and shame? And biblically, can we find something that kind of defines those terms? And I found this verse, which I think is a really good one. It's Paul. He says there's two kinds of sorrow, and he's talking about guilt and shame. He says godly sorrow, which is guilt, godly sorrow brings repentance that leads to salvation and leaves no regret. Worldly sorrow, which is shame, just brings death. And so it's important to kind of see the thing. Godly sorrow means you've done something wrong and you're aware of it. And if you feel guilty when you've done something wrong, you should feel guilty. If you've lied to your spouse and now you've got to look them in the eye, you should feel guilty about that. You should feel guilty because you did something wrong. But it's not the end of the world. I mean, today was a bad day, but you still got tomorrow. And godly sorrow makes a decision to turn. It's not who you are, it's just what you did. And so you make this decision to turn. Godly sorrow inspires repentance, which leads to salvation, takes you someplace else. Shame's different. When I have shame, there's nothing really I can do about it because it's who I am. There's something about me that's unattractive or unappealing. There's something about me that looks bad that I'm trying to hide. And when you feel that, and especially when you let that get its head, then that just kills you. Sometimes we can be ashamed of stuff we did. I saw a guy a couple of weeks ago that I haven't seen for 30 years. And I remembered him before he remembered me. And I saw him and, hey, how you doing? And he knew quickly my name, and quickly we were starting to kind of connect some things. And I said, yeah, it's been a long time. And then it hit him, oh, yeah, I know. And we're talking, and we're having a conversation about some people we both knew and different things. And he said, now you would have known me then when I was in high school. And I said, yeah. Oh, he said, I'm sorry. And some of you are like that, right? If they knew you in high school, it's like, oh, I'm sorry. Or if they knew you when you were 20, oh, sorry, you probably, and you did something a long time ago and you've never gotten past it. And if anybody brings it up, you're just killed again. I'm never going to get past this thing. And that's shame. You may have repented, you may have changed, but you just can't let it go in your heart. And when you have some shame about who you used to be, that can kill you. Sometimes it can come from some deficiency that you have. I'm not as smart as I would like to be. I'm not as successful as I'd like to be. I don't have as much money in the bank as I would like to have. I feel like I rank unfavorably to my brothers or my sisters or to my parents or to my neighbors or whoever else. I just don't rank the same. And whenever we're together, I feel that they've accomplished something that I've not accomplished, and I feel small, and I don't like to feel small, and that shame creeps in. Sometimes it can be where we're from. You can be ashamed of your family or ashamed of your town, that it's not as good or as rich or as successful as something else. Interestingly enough, Jesus never did that. He never felt that same kind of thing that we all struggle with. There's a verse that says that the one who made people holy, talking about Jesus, and the ones who are being made holy, which is talking about us, we're in the same family, and so Jesus isn't ashamed of us. I mean, it doesn't matter what we do or what kind of deficiencies we have or who we are. And it's not just us, but you see it in the New Testament. You see with those apostles. You see with the guys he's hanging out with. He's just not ashamed to be identified with other people. Sometimes we can be ashamed of our faith. I'm a Christian, but I keep it quiet. I don't want anybody to know I'm a Christian because they'll think I'm dumb. Or they'll think that I'm part of some cult. Or they'll think that I'm not scientific, or I don't know things that they know, and I don't want to look bad, so I'm ashamed of it. And Jesus warns us to be careful about that. He says, if you're going to be ashamed of me, then I'm going to be ashamed of you and not take you in. He's given us everything, right? So when we turn our back on him because he embarrasses us, it hurts. And you know what that's like to have somebody turn their back on you. Anyway, Paul, the Apostle Paul, struggled with all those things at different times, I think. He says a couple different places that he's unimpressive to look at. He mentions that in his letters, that he's unimpressive to listen to. He says, I'm not that much to be around. He says, not just that, but his past mistakes were terribly hurtful in his heart. He says, if you had only known me then, I used to be violent and cruel. He says, of all the sinners in the world, Paul says, I'm the worst. And I think he believed it. But then later, Paul says this thing, and it's an important verse. It's kind of what Brian was saying in his communion meditation. Yet this is no cause for shame, because I know whom I believed in, and I'm convinced that he's able to guard what I've entrusted to him unto that day. I find that if Jesus could take a chance on me, then maybe I can take a chance on him. And if Jesus could take a chance on me, and his is the only opinion that I care about, then I can hold my head up no matter where I'm at and not allow myself to be scared to connect. You know the weird thing, and I don't mean to pick on Brian here, and I hope I'm not. I don't mean to be. When Brian's up here and he's opening his heart to you guys on that communion meditation, he's telling you what's going on inside, does that make you feel closer to Brian or further away? Closer, right? It actually made you like him more. And yet, I'm just terrified to do that. Isn't that weird? We think if people can see our weaknesses that they won't like us, and usually it makes you like them more. If you just are open. And Paul got to the place where, if Jesus believes in me, then I'm gonna live my life, and I'm going to keep my focus on him, and I'm going to do the things I'm supposed to do. We talk about in a church all the time about getting connected with other Christians. Man, that's just so powerfully important, but a lot of Christians don't do it. They don't. They find all sorts of reasons to keep themselves isolated. We talk about how important it is to connect yourself deeply with God, to open your heart to him and show him, and to share God with other people, but people don't do it. They're ashamed of God, or they're ashamed of their connections, or they're ashamed of what they know, and they aren't vulnerable. We just learn how to protect ourselves. One more thing here on this idea. Hebrews chapter 12. This is one of my favorite verses. It says, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, for the joy set before him endured the cross, ignoring or scorning its shame. Whatever else the cross was, it was embarrassing. The cross was certainly very painful, but you're nailed there for hours, and people are yelling insults at you, and they're mocking you, and you just got to take it. And you don't have anything by the time you're on the cross. I mean, they're gambling for his clothes. Jesus is kind of like the anti-Superman. Superman's invulnerable. Jesus is completely vulnerable, which makes me like him more. But this verse talks about all that we should fix our eyes on him who gave up so much for us to find some strength. The same verse in a different version, sometimes taking the same verse in a different Bible version gives you a different kind of color on it. This one here, we must keep our eyes on Jesus who leads us and makes our faith complete. He endured the shame of being nailed to a cross because he knew that fear, he knew that later he'd be glad he did. I want to focus on that phrase. He endured the cross. He took the shame of that because he knew that later he'd be glad he did. That's what I want to challenge you to do. You know, the whole purpose of these 4 weeks of sermons is so that you'll take the chance again to build relationships. In your family, if there's some breakdowns in your family, take initiative. You have much more power there than you think that you do. If you've blown it and you're just scared to even talk any longer in your family, take a chance. Just take a chance. If you don't think that you can witness, the most common thing somebody will tell me, if I say to them, hey, you should go witness, the most common thing people tell me is, I don't know what I would say. What if they ask me a question and I don't know the answer, right? That's always the number one thing. Take a chance. That's just shame talking. What you're saying is, I'm afraid I'll look stupid. There's a good chance some of you are going to look stupid anyway. I didn't put that in first service, so I shouldn't have put that in here. Brene Brown. Anyway, Brene Brown. Back to this sociologist. She said, Americans, let me write this here. We numb vulnerability. It's something as a culture we do. We numb vulnerability. I'm scared to ask for help because I'm sick and we're newly married. I'm scared to initiate sex with my husband. I'm scared to initiate sex with my wife. I'm scared of being turned down. I'm scared of asking someone else. I'm scared of waiting for the doctor to call back. The problem, I'm scared of all those things. The problem is that you can't selectively numb your emotion. You can't say, well, here's the bad stuff, vulnerability and grief and shame and fear and disappointment. I don't want to feel those. But when you numb those things and you close yourself off, then you also numb joy and gratitude and happiness. You don't get to choose. And as Americans, we're great at numbing our vulnerability. Compared to every other generation of Americans who's ever lived, we are the most in debt. We're the most overweight. We're the most addicted. We're the most medicated. I mean, a person comes home from a hard day at work and says, I'm just so tired, I'm going to veg out on the couch here and watch some television. And no one ever has come up for that hour of television and said, now I can take the day, right? That never energizes anyone. It's just about not feeling anything. And as a culture, we do that. We do it all the time, and you can't selectively numb your emotion. When you close off that part of you, when you say, I'm just not going to get too deep with anybody, then you can't be like Jesus. So take a risk. I'm going to mention, before I get into this thing very deeply, of course, it's okay for you to be careful around people who are dangerous, right? There's a book called Boundaries, which is a fantastic book by Henry Cloud, and he says, some things that unsafe people do. Unsafe people won't admit their weakness. An unsafe person won't ever apologize for anything, right? How many of you have known somebody who's like that? 2 of you have. Wow. How bad for those 2. How many of you have known somebody like that? Right? All right. How many of you are sitting beside somebody? Don't do that one. I'm just don't do that. I'm teasing on that one. So that's one thing. He says unsafe people demand trust instead of earning it. They might do bad things. They demand that you elevate them to the most secret part of your heart, and they haven't earned any of that. They've not done any of the work to get there. Unsafe people will apologize sometimes, but they don't ever change. Maybe they'll toss out an apology like, hey, I'm sorry if that made you mad. I'm sorry if that hurt your feelings. But they don't really apologize for what they're doing. Some other things that he doesn't mention, Henry Cloud, is maybe they gossip about you, or they're judgmental, or maybe they don't listen. I mean, I understand. And if you've tried with somebody and they've rejected you, you're allowed to take a break. That's okay. I mean, you're allowed to do that. What I'm talking about more is how we let that guardedness keep us from the relationships that we desperately need. Apart from Jesus himself, this is the hard part here, because this could come off, even as I'm saying it, it feels like it's the wrong thing to say, like it's arrogant somehow. Same thing Brian said when he was up here. Some of you may look at me and say, I like the things he's saying. Makes a lot of sense. Other guys might look at me and roll their eyes, and that's okay. Well, it's not okay. It'll hurt my feelings. But, that's just one of those things. And it's just how life is. But if there's anything about my life that you say, you know what, I think he's on the right track. I think I should do some of those things that he's doing. I want to tell you that apart from Jesus himself, I wouldn't be here if it weren't me connecting with some deep Christians along the way who have helped me figure it out. One thing that's a hard thing now is that most of the groups that I would be participating in, I'm in charge of. So even there, I've had to put myself under some people so I can. They're the mentor. I'm learning, and man, if as soon as you quit doing that, then I quit growing. And for the Christian who comes into here and they never deeply connect with other people, man, I don't know. I don't know if you can be Christian and do that. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I can't imagine how it's possible. A person might come to me and say, I just had a terrible experience with another small group, and I'm never going to do that again. Well, man, you're going to let some jerk decide the rest of your life? It's a weird thing we do as people. We allow the ones who have hurt us the very most to decide what kind of human beings we're going to be. And that's insane. It's just nuts, and everybody does that. I mean, it's not, if you do that, you're in the, welcome to the crew. We all do that, but it's just crazy. And I understand, like I said, to be guarded around dangerous people makes a world of sense. You got to do what you got to do. But that guardedness can't extend to everybody. Just make a decision that this is what I believe, and I'm going to be bold about this. And if I can't share my faith with you, if I can't talk about the important things to me, then what kind of friends are we anyway? Acknowledge it when you're wrong, and get deep with a few people. You just have no idea how big a difference it would make. A couple of weeks ago, somebody gave me a quote, and I've been reading it, and I didn't like it when I first read it. It hit me really hard, and it smacked me around, and I didn't like it. And I've meditated on it at different times. I've taken some time to think about it. And it's by Henry Nouwen, and he says, I think that the wound of loneliness is like the Grand Canyon. It's a deep incision in the surface of our existence, which has become an inexhaustible source of beauty and self-understanding. In other words, from Nouwen's perspective, loneliness is good. Like the Grand Canyon. It's a big scar in the ground, but millions of people want to see it because there's something beautiful about it. And the beauty is the self-understanding, I think. When I allow myself to feel that burden, and I don't quickly numb it with my phone or with television or with a beer or with whatever, you know. If I don't do that, if I just, I'm lonely for a moment and I allow myself to be in that moment, it makes me aware of how much I need God, of how much I need others. It makes me aware that I'm not the end of the world. You know, I'm just one guy. It shows me my limitations, and it shows me my strengths, and it reminds me that God is still moving me someplace. It helps me understand that I'm not finished. And all those things are beautiful. I mean, all those things are important, and you need to know them. And if I close myself off from that part of myself, if I refuse to get deeply with anybody, you know, if I refuse to really open myself up, if I refuse to ever be mentored, if my first reaction is always defensive, if my first reaction is always negative, I don't know, I'm missing something. And what I'm talking about, again, is such an American thing. It's something we all deal with, or at least most people do. So, again, my word to you is we just need to look at Jesus. You know, when we're in that moment, we just need to look at Jesus, who both began and finished this race that we're in. We need to study how he did it, because he never lost sight of where he was headed. I mean, that exhilarating finish in and with God, he could put up with anything along the way, cross and shame and whatever, and now he's there. I mean, he's right there in the place of honor. He's right alongside God. And so when you find yourself flagging in your faith, go over that story again, item by item, that long litany of hostility that he plowed through, and that's going to shoot some adrenaline into your soul. So let's think about it. And the band can come back up if they don't mind. When we believe that it's not good for a man to be alone, and yet we are alone, and that God sees us here, and that sometimes because we're alone, we try to fill that void with 1,000 different things, and but nothing really fills it except for him. And after trying all those different things, maybe you came to Jesus and you said, Lord, you take it. You take all of it. And Jesus sees you in that moment. Now, Jesus, before you ever came along, saw you. Jesus, before you ever were part of the deal, knew you'd be along. And Jesus agreed to make a trade. The Bible says that he who had no sin became sin for us so that we can become the righteousness of God. Jesus agreed to take your sin and to pay for that on the cross. To give it all away. To pay for everything. Jesus paid for all the shame, so you don't need to have shame anymore. That he who began a good work in you will certainly carry it on to completion. It's just a matter of putting your hand in his again. And so at the end of the service here, if there's anybody here who needs again to reconnect with Jesus, this place in the front is open. If you've made a life out of being bulletproof and no one gets too close to you, man, the front of the church is open. And it'll take some courage. It'll take some heart for you to come up here. It'll take some courage. It'll take some heart for you to pray where you're at. But there's such power in that. You can't even imagine. So let me pray with you to get you started. And then if anybody wants to come up, you can come up here at the end. Dear God, I do pray for this group. And if there's anybody here, God, who needs to know you better, then I pray you open that door. And I pray for the person here, God, if there is somebody here who is very aware of their shame. Maybe they've done some things in their past that they're not proud of, and some of those things still linger, still hurt. Maybe, God, there's some people here who just feel like they're less than. Every moment of the day, there's always something keeping them from being who they're supposed to be. Or maybe there's some people, God, who still are in the middle of some sinful thing. And they try, but they can't seem to get past it. And they wonder, God, if you've given up on them. And I pray for those people especially, God, that they see the cross behind me today. And remember that you paid for everything. In Jesus' name, amen.